Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. This week we have an interview for you conducted by Mona with Allison Bovell, and she is going to be talking about issues surrounding hunger in America. It's a really great interview. Really excited to share this with you today. If you have anything that you want to add to the conversation that you're about to listen to, you can do that at the show notes at irenicast.com/35. And you can also give us feedback anytime at irenicast.com/feedback. So without any further ado, we're going to go right into the interview.
Hello, everyone. This is Mona, and we have a special treat today. We have an interview with Allison, who works for Children's Health Watch, and I've invited her to come on the show and talk to us about food stamps and food insecurity in the face of hunger in America. And she has such a wealth of knowledge and resources, so I'm so thrilled to have her today. How are you today, Allison?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we want to talk about hunger, and we haven't really done a show on hunger yet. We wanted to bring someone in who really knew what they were talking about. So my first question for you is, can you just talk about what hunger looks like in the U.S. today? I heard a stat recently that 1 in 6 kids go to bed hungry. Is that accurate?
When we use the word hunger here in the United States, we typically are referring to food insecurity. So food insecurity is a state of when a household does not have enough resources, monetary resources, to afford enough food for all family members to live active and healthy lives. And so about 20% of our nation's children are living in households that lack the resources to provide enough healthy food for all family members. And the way that works typically is when a household cannot afford enough food, the adults start cutting the size of their meals or start skipping meals, and then they start cutting the quality of meals for all household members. And then in the most extreme cases, children are forced to either cut the size of their meals or skip meals, which all of these have direct consequences on the health and development of children, and our health as a nation. And so even at the lowest levels of food insecurity, so when families start worrying about being able to afford enough groceries or running out of food before the month ends, we see some negative health outcomes for families and children.
Thanks for explaining that. And so my role today in this interview is probably just going to be throwing all the myths that I've ever heard about food insecurity and hunger, because I actually have learned a lot from you just having conversations about this kind of thing. For example, there's a pretty big myth, I think, in all of the parenting world that, that people who don't feed their kids nutritious food are just bad parents, and they should be punished for that. Like, for example, I once was on the bus and I saw a woman feeding her 2-year-old potato chips for breakfast. And my instinct was to be really upset. But then I thought twice about it, and I thought twice about what might lead to that kind of decision. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So if anyone does their own grocery shopping listening to this podcast, I'm sure you are well aware of the price discrepancy in the price of food in our country. So fruits and vegetables and whole grains and dairy products and of the sort, the things that are good for us and are part of a well-balanced diet, those are some of the most expensive foods in our grocery stores. And yet we go down the chips and the cookies and the sugar-sweetened beverages aisle, and we see that those prices are lower and lower and lower. And so when parents are faced with a child who is hungry, many of them will, and they don't have enough money to afford some apples or carrots that you have to eat more of those to fill your stomach. They often go for the caloric intake over nutritious meals. And so if the only thing that you can afford to feed your child that day is potato chips for breakfast, whereas, something like oatmeal or something is going to actually be better for them. If you don't have the money to afford oatmeal, you're going to buy the potato chips and you're just going to make do. And we see this a lot. I have never met a mother that wants to feed their child junk food, and they're pained over this. They actually feel a lot of sorrow over the fact that they know their kids love grapes and cherries and vegetables, and yet they can't afford that because those are some of the most expensive things on the market today in terms of food.
Why is it that expensive? Why you would think that processed foods would cost more because of the cost of producing them?
Right. Well, it has to do with the way our farm subsidy programs were set up. So the government after the Great Depression began to subsidize farms because farmers were hit really heavily during that time, and they wanted to have enough food for the nation. And at the time, farms were mostly made up of small family farmers, owned a plot of land in Iowa, were growing food off of that land. And as the industry grew bigger and bigger and agribusiness started to get more and more powerful, those farm subsidies, which were intended to go away once the market took over, never let the market take over, never let the businesses grow in the way that they were naturally growing, and the farm subsidies remained. And so today, the majority of our subsidized foods go to commodity products such as commodity corn and soy, and all of these things go into processed foods. So basically, the government is giving large businesses incentive to continue to make processed foods, and there's less incentive to grow fruits and vegetables, which can be more labor intensive.
Yeah, and then you add issues like climate change and droughts, and
yes.
it gets more difficult to actually distribute affordable produce.
Right.
And then going back to the issue of the mother, and I understand you run a lot of focus groups. So you're actually working with women directly,
right.
In particular moms, right,
mm-hmm.
of young children who mm-hmm. are living with food insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
But the resource issue too. If a mom is working 2 or 3 jobs to support her kids, she might literally not have the time or energy to prepare meals like that are nutritious on a regular basis. Is that right?
That's right. Actually, yes. There's been plenty of studies that have shown the real value of food stamps, which I will refer to as SNAP. So in the 2008 Farm Bill, which is the bill that authorizes our spending for the federal nutrition programs like SNAP and these farm subsidies, among some other things, changed the program name from the food stamp program to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. So if you ever hear someone talk about SNAP or talk about food stamps, they're referring to the same thing.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah, I didn't know that.
Yes. So the Institute of Medicine has looked at what the real value of SNAP is. And so SNAP can only be used to purchase unprepared foods. So if you go to the supermarket, you might want to, if you're going to save time, you might want to purchase a rotisserie chicken, for instance. But you cannot purchase a rotisserie chicken with your SNAP benefits because that's a prepared food.
Interesting.
So all of the food that's purchased on SNAP is unprepared, and which means that it takes more time to prepare a meal. And the real value of SNAP is far less than what a family is able to afford a healthful meal. And Children's Health Watch has done research to show that, but also the Institute of Medicine put out a report in 2013 showing that same thing.
Okay, so I have so many questions already for me. So first of all, if you said it's not enough, SNAP is not enough. Can you just give us a ballpark for a family of 4?
So I'll just break down that question a little bit more into sort of a tangible thing to think about. So the average benefit per person per day is about $4. So
$4 a day?
$4 a day per person.
Oh my God.
So if you can imagine not only buying food, but buying food that you have enough time to prepare, it becomes really difficult. They have what's called the SNAP Challenge, where they challenge people, particularly policymakers or people interested in food insecurity, to live on this $4 a day. And several members of Congress did it a couple years ago. And I heard Representative Jim McGovern, who's a representative from Massachusetts and a real champion for anti-hunger issues, talk about his experience taking the SNAP challenge. And he just talked about how cranky he was. You know, he couldn't afford coffee on $4 a day. He ate a lot of lentils, which he was very sick of by the end of it. And his reflection of the experience was so beautiful because he said, you know, at the end of it, I knew that my week was going to be over and I was going to go back to eating what I wanted to eat. But my constituents and the people that have put me in office don't get to leave that reality, don't get to suddenly wake up and have more money in their pockets to afford more food and healthful food. And so for him, that was a driving force around this issue and around ensuring that the SNAP program is strengthened and is fully funded, which is really difficult. It's under a lot of attack constantly.
I hear so much negativity around food stamps that people, a lot of people on the news or just kind of my social circles will just kind of spew this vehement rhetoric around begrudging the fact that we have to help feed some people in this country. A lot of people need our assistance. And I learned recently that actually we consider zero unemployment in this country at 5%. Set by the Fed. So this is a couple decades old policy, but basically when we say we've reached no unemployment in this country, we're using a baseline of 5%. So 5% of the people in the US literally can't find jobs. There's no jobs available for them. Right. And so you're talking millions of people. So this is not only people working low income jobs who can't find a higher rate of pay, but people who cannot find jobs and are supporting other people or elderly people who have retired and cannot work.
That's right. About 80% of the families that are receiving, people that are receiving SNAP are children or disabled or elderly households. There's been a couple of studies that look at employment rates either just before or just after receiving SNAP, and almost 90% of families that have received SNAP were either working just before or just after. So that shows us that there is a direct relationship, and a lot of other research shows us that there's a direct relationship with SNAP participation and work. I've never met someone living on SNAP who says that they want to be living like that. I've never talked to a mother who desires to wander every month, in the fourth week of the month, whether they're going to make it to the next month, with the benefits that they have and the resources that they have available. It's a stressful time. Food insecurity is linked to a number of health issues that you possibly might expect: metabolic syndromes, iron deficiency, anemia, increased hospitalization among children. But it's also linked to psychosocial effects, depressive symptoms for caregivers, to really impacting the entire person and the entire family. I talk to parents all the time that worry and tell me that they cry out of the earshot of their children because they just don't know how they're going to make it sometimes from one month to the next. And that these programs are really a life support. They're really, they are public health programs. They are a way that people can transition and can be lifted out of poverty. But really they're a stopgap measure until the economy picks up. And I think the way that the SNAP program was designed gets a lot of criticism. So it's an entitlement program, meaning if you meet the income base for the SNAP program, then you are able to apply and participate in the program. Whereas other programs that have, for instance, the welfare program, which was block granted starting in the 90s, and block granted to states and administered through states, you're not necessarily entitled to that program. But the SNAP program is really designed to expand and retract with the growth of the economy. So when a recession hits, it is a program that is designed to rapidly respond to the increased need of people, because I believe, and I hope that many other people believe, that food is a basic human right and that we need to make sure that people are fed.
And it's preventative, right? Because if you offer money to feed people, you're taking the burden off medical care. You're keeping people in their homes. Mm-hmm. You're keeping kids in school, right? Because they have the energy and the sustenance to be able to engage in other parts of life. Right. It seems like there's such a huge public fear that if we actually make these programs habitable, like if we actually give people enough to live on, that people will just depend on the state and be, the Reagan era welfare queen. Right. So I wondered if you can talk more about that, and even I think we talked about recent measures that we're trying to get voted through that would block people on SNAP from buying things like steak and lobster. Is that right?
Yeah. And I believe that was in Kansas, some state measures. Yeah.
Why do we want to keep this a shameful thing?
Sure. I think, one thing to address this welfare queen, or as Paul Ryan put it, the hammock. I believe it was Paul Ryan. The hammock of the safety net. I think that is, one, not informed by any experience directly with people receiving these public assistance programs. I think if anyone has been through the application process for the SNAP program, it's not easy. And it's not a thing that I think people want to do. You're providing a ton of information to the government and having to go out and to say, I need help. And that is, for many people, a shameful experience. And knowing that they rely on these programs to get themselves through, for most of the people that I meet, it's not something that they're proud of. They would like to work a job that pays them enough money, that gives them enough hours to feed their children. And yet we live in a nation and an economy that doesn't provide that. And so they rely on these programs to get them through. And I think that well, first of all, there have been no studies that link directly food stamp participation to obesity. So there's this idea of, people on SNAP are just eating really poorly and they have poorer eating habits than the rest of us. There was actually a review of the literature study about a month ago that looked at all of the literature around food purchases on SNAP and actually showed that really people are not purchasing, more sugar-sweetened beverages, for instance, or other things. Those purchases are really out of what we had talked about earlier, part of being low income, not just being on the SNAP program. And I think that there's this idea of if you're poor, you shouldn't get any luxuries. And that's, I think, really horrible. I mean, one, we can show the impact that poverty has on psychosocial factors. We don't need to elevate that in our society. And I was talking to one of my colleagues when all of these conversations were going on about restricting the purchase of steaks and seafood and for people on SNAP. And prior to working at Children's Health Watch, she was a SNAP outreach worker for a large organization that helped people apply for the program. And her job was to go and sit in nursing homes and assisted living facilities and help elders apply for the program. And many elders are only eligible for about $14 to $17 for SNAP because of the way the math works out.
Like a month?
A month. Yeah.
What?
And so, right. And so some of them, would look at that and say, well, it's just not worth my time. I don't want this. But she said, very often she would talk to elders who would say, you know what, I'm going to take that and I'm going to have a nice meal once a month. You know, I'm going to have that steak with my sweetheart, because we exist in an institution, or we live in this place where we eat not great food all of the time. And at the end of my life, I want one joyous meal a month. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and we can all think of those times where you splurged on a meal because it meant something. Mm-hmm. It was a birthday, it was an anniversary. And we remember those times gathering around the table, or I remember those times in my white middle-class family gathering around the table around a special meal that maybe cost a little bit more. And I cannot imagine wanting to take that away from someone else. And I think it's incredibly patronizing to tell people how to feed their families. And it's painful, and I think it's just hateful, really.
Something you said earlier really just caught me, just reframing social assistance programs. It's interesting that people say entitlement like it's a prideful thing, but really it's more like a basic human right. And if you see social assistance as the right to dignity, and that's part of what it means to be American, it's really incredibly patriotic to say we live in a land of abundance. We should make sure everyone can at least eat.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that these are public assistance programs. They are benefiting the public. They are not only benefiting the health of our nation, so we save money in the health system. We're not spending a lot. If we feed all of our citizens well, then we're going to spend less on preventative illnesses or the exacerbation of chronic illnesses that can be regulated through diet. But we also improve our education system. Children do better in schools. They're better prepared for the workforce. We have a stronger workforce. We also just benefit from a society that exhibits care of one another, that when you have a hard time, when someone in your family loses a job or is working at a job with volatile wages, that we say that we're going to take care of them. I often tell people, just because you don't drive on a road doesn't mean that you don't benefit from it. And those are government dollars that were spent on that road that maybe were used to transport other goods and services that you didn't actually participate in, but we still benefit from a system that works, and all of us do. And I think one thing that I've learned from a lot of the families that I work with is they always say, you never know what's going to happen to you. Many, many families in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. And when that paycheck goes away, for whatever reason, through an injury, through a job loss, a turn in the economy, then they could be in that line waiting to apply for SNAP benefits. But also on the economic front, SNAP is good for the economy. Every $1 in SNAP, economic research has shown, produces about $1.73 in the nation's economy, which produces jobs for grocers and employees. So it really generates and boosts the economy.
It's an investment.
It's an investment. And that's why during the stimulus package in 2009, the SNAP benefits were boosted. It was not only to protect the country from the rising rates of food insecurity because of the increase in unemployment, but it was also a way to boost the economy, to put money into communities, and people spend money on food in their communities. And so it will create more jobs in people's communities, put more money back into states and into localities.
That's incredible. I mean, I didn't know that it had that kind of rate of return. It's so some people would argue that job of providing food does not belong to the government, but that should be done through charities and churches and local organizations. What do you think about that idea?
Sure. I mean, I think it's great that we have churches and local nonprofits to provide food, but that is an emergency assistance stopgap. That is not enough to meet the needs of people. So I love this illustration that Joel Berg, who's a big hunger leader in New York uses. He says, for a long time in this country, we fought fires with local bucket brigades. So if there was a fire in your neighborhood, then the bucket brigade would come out, and it was volunteer, and you pass buckets of water until you put out the fire. Well, when we were doing that, plenty of cities burned down because that wasn't enough. Relying on volunteers who perhaps are asleep in the middle of the night aren't enough to put out the fire in your neighborhood. And so we began to develop municipal authorities, fire departments, invest money in putting out fires. And I don't know of any city that would decide to not invest something in making sure that in the middle of the night, if your house is on fire, that there's not a fire truck there to put out the fire. And so if we continue to say, well, we should just rely on churches and community groups out of their own good free will to provide enough food, then that's just not enough. It's never going to be enough, and it's never going to be a sure thing. I think also sort of on another end of that is hunger and food insecurity are invisible. We don't walk around and look at people and know whether they are experiencing this or not. And so to rely on a system that is not equipped to address a need that it cannot see, then I think it's a big shortfall. We're not going to be able to provide enough. We're not going to be able, and we're also not going to restore dignity to people to be able to sit around a family table with their children and eat food that they have chosen and purchased to eat.
Yeah, and it's incredible how interrelated these issues are.
Sure.
I was recently talking to a pastor friend of mine who pastors at a historically Black church, and no decent grocery stores will move into their neighborhood that are affordable. And even the grocery stores that it's a chain grocery store, because it's in a more poor, like lower class neighborhood that happens to also be African American in urban environment. The produce section in particular is really poor quality and also expensive, and way more poor quality than the more wealthy neighborhoods. And they've petitioned several different grocery store chains to come in their neighborhood, but they're in what's considered a food desert. So I want to talk to you more about that in a minute. But what this particular church did was say, well, our congregants really want fresh produce and really can't get it. They don't have access. They can't get to it. So they started a community garden. But the pastor was really frustrated that winter was coming and they weren't going to be able to provide this food. And the church was even subsidizing the food so that people could buy it at a really affordable rate. But now that the neighborhood is gentrifying and more white people who have higher incomes are moving into the community, they're starting to see Starbucks being built, and they're starting to see these stores, and they might get a grocery store, but it might be too late because all the people who were able to afford to live there no longer can and are being forced to move out because they can't afford the housing anymore. And so it's interesting how that all converges to me, and it becomes a race and class issue. Or it is a class issue, and it becomes a race issue because of the history of racism in America. So it's so hard to unravel how to approach that. But all that to say that I think the charity approach, it's a lot of really good-hearted people, but I wish some of that energy and that money was put into changing the policy so that literally everybody can be provided for, not just the people who happen to have access to a church or happen to have transportation or happen to know whoever to get their one meal a week or whatever it is.
Yeah. And the people I talk to who, the times that they've had to use food pantries or food banks or soup kitchens, they talk about how it's just not the best experience. There's a joy in meal planning for many people, and for standing around the kitchen and for cooking your own meal. And when you have to rely on the box that some stranger prepared, and that's going to be your groceries for the week, I think that really takes some of the joy out of cooking, or at least for the mothers that I've talked to, for them. And also sort of within diverse communities and, the amount of diversity culturally that we have in this country. I know a lot of Haitian people, for instance, and Haitian cooking is perhaps a different grocery list than you might get whenever you go to the food pantry and you receive that box of food. All of the things in there might be foreign to you. You don't know how to cook it. You don't know what to do with these things. And so I think there's a little bit of a frustration of, well, one size fits all, and we're just going to provide for people this way. And that's not how we exist, and that's not how we live in communities.
Yeah. This whole conversation, there's just so many directions we can go with this. And I so appreciate the way you're able to explain this in a way that's really graspable, because these are huge issues. But what I'm thinking about right now is school lunches and all of the recent attempts to get school lunches defunded for low-income students. Mm-hmm. And so can we just say, if we just take an average kid, like let's say mm-hmm. his name is Brian.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
An average kid, maybe who's in first or second grade. Mm-hmm. What does living with food insecurity do to that kid?
Sure. Food insecurity has implications from the prenatal period all the way through adulthood. And so we see a number of different effects, some of them sort of usual suspects. So more stomach aches, more sick days, more feelings of nausea, or we also see among younger children increased risk of developmental delays. So they are not hitting some of those developmental milestones, which are really important. So for young children, the hungriest part of the body is the brain. My boss is a pediatrician, and she always sends this chart when she's talking to medical students about the rapid brain growth that happens between ages 0 to 3, or prenatal period to 3. And by the time we're 3, about 75% of our brain is developed. And so if we're not nourished during those early years, and then it continues to develop at a pretty good rate through childhood and adolescence, and then as you might imagine, once the prefrontal cortex is developed in early adulthood, then we start to see a leveling off in development. So this is a really important time for brain development and body development. And so children through all age periods need proper nutrition. There's also studies that have shown food insecurity among adolescents has an increased risk of depression, and they have higher rates of suicide attempts. And so, sort of at every epoch, we see children directly affected by food insecurity. And I do want to just stress the point, because I think when we talk about childhood hunger, we always imagine the child that didn't eat dinner. And that indeed is happening in this country, and we should be alarmed by it. We should also be talking about the children whose parents didn't eat dinner, because that is also linked to negative health and developmental outcomes. So it's a family issue. This is not just, did a child get lunch at school, but did that child getting lunch at school free up enough resources for their family to be able to provide dinner? And that's what I think we lose sight of sometimes, that children exist within contexts, and that programs like the SNAP program, in combination with the National School Lunch and the National School Breakfast program and the Program for Women's, Infants, and Children, WIC, are important for wraparound nutrition services for families, that they are able to all afford food to have active and healthy lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting, that word in particular, insecurity. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this in the past of even if someone does eat for a week straight and they get all 3 meals for mm-hmm. a week, the idea of not knowing if you'll eat next week,
right?
The stress and the worry and what is likely very traumatic experience mm-hmm. for not only parents to have to go through to not know if you can feed yourself and your children, but mm-hmm. for kids to know right. that that's also what the family has to go through.
Right.
And to live with that stress all the time
right.
is almost debilitating.
Yeah. So there's a rising amount of neurological research around toxic stress, really being head up at Harvard University at the Center for Developing Child. So stress is okay when you're in early childhood or throughout life, when it's in small amounts. So for instance, when a child's mom leaves the room, for instance, and the child cries and the elevated stress level goes up, but then eventually the child can be consoled and can come back to a normal state. But children living in poverty are living in very stressful situations that are often not regulated in a way that they can bring down their stress levels. So if your parent is constantly in an elevated state of stress, if they're not able to interact with you in a way that is conducive to healthy development, then that's actually going to affect the structure of your brain. We've seen an impact on the way that the neurons and the actual architecture of brains are developed, and a difference between brains that are developed living in poverty and brains that are developed among families that are not. And so the lasting and compounding stress of food insecurity, which often exists along with other stressors, such as not living in safe and affordable housing, or parents worrying about whether they're going to be able to pay the utility bills or for prescription bills or transportation. All of these things contribute to how children develop. And that has an impact on the way that they are able to problem solve, to sit still in classrooms, to understand their world. And so this is not to say that children living in poverty are lost. There are a lot of things that we can do to make sure that they have safe environments and to make sure that their families are protected from some of these hardships. It's going to take all of us realizing that we need to make a commitment to end poverty. And it's not to say that children living in poverty can't come out of that and live successfully, but we really need two-generation approaches to this issue. We really need to recognize that the parents need to be served just as much as the children, and that creating a world where children can live and thrive is one that is paramount to the future of this nation.
That's so well said. And I'm thinking also of the issue of minimum wage, because the dollars that you make at a low income job, a retail job, a job working at, Starbucks or McDonald's or Macy's or whatever, these jobs are not as paying as powerfully as they did even 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, $20 could buy a whole cart full of groceries, essentially. And today you can buy only a couple of items, and our minimum wage has not reflected that shift. And so that seems like a really closely knit sister issue, because if you give people a higher living wage, they don't have to rely as much on government assistance because they can actually provide for their families. Right.
Yeah. There's been a lot of economic research that shows that, particularly around the 70s, there was a diversion in the way that wages were growing and productivity. So we're more productive now, and we're being paid less. And so it's a minimum wage issue. It's a living wage issue. It's a work volatility issue, that people that are working in jobs where it's different from week to week. You don't know if you're going to work full-time this week, part-time next week. You don't know if you're going to have a job next month. All of those things are contributing to this fabric of economic hardship and economic insecurities. And we need to address our economic policies, and we need to look at creative solutions to this issue. One of the things that Children's Health Watch has recently gotten very involved in, we've been, active in supporting programs like SNAP for a long, long time. But recently we started looking at the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a credit for low and middle income working families at tax time. And there's been a lot of health research recently that shows that this is this boosts academic performance. It boosts for the next generation, the wages that they have, their ability to participate in the workforce. It lowers low birth weight rates, which is incredibly significant for child health and development and public health. It also increases healthy food. So we see that when people have more money, they purchase healthier food. And so I think that looking at sort of the way that interlocking programs are able to address multiple issues, the way we recently published a brief looking at the impact that housing subsidies with SNAP benefits and WIC benefits, so the nutrition program for very young children, has on housing insecurity. And we saw that families who were receiving nutrition assistance along with their housing benefits were more likely to be in safe and stable housing than those who were not receiving the nutrition benefits and only receiving the housing subsidy alone. So when we look at families holistically, when we look at communities holistically, and we start thinking about the way our policies can address that, then we can make inroads not just in the hunger field, but also in housing and in energy and healthcare.
It's just amazingly complex how it all links together.
Yeah.
So I think you've done a really great job painting a picture for us of why these things are important. If you can say a little bit more perhaps about why the rates of food insecurity are so high today.
Sure. One, they're directly connected to the economy. So like I said, this is an economic state. So when you don't have enough money to afford food, then you're categorized as food insecure. I think also some of our tightening up of our policies are perhaps contributing. It's really hard to get SNAP benefits. I think I saw a recent statistic that said 1 in 5 people who are eligible for food stamps or for SNAP benefits are not receiving them. So I think there's a number of different issues related to food insecurity, but I think the number one thing is economics.
And I'm also thinking of how this relates to criminal justice. And I'm sorry to bring in all these other issues.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to get a really big picture of this. How deep the punishing goes. So not only do we shame people for needing assistance, we don't give them enough assistance to actually live comfortably and get the nutrition that their bodies need when they do get assistance. And especially for children who grow up in systems where they're under high amounts of stress. And you even use the word toxic stress, which has a traumatic component, a neurological component, a development component. And then the students likely will develop behavioral issues because they're hungry and miserable all the time. They can't pay attention. They can't focus. They can't take tests. They get behind in their educational system. And then by the time they graduate high school, if they graduate, they're low functioning in society. And then we incarcerate them because they probably are making decisions at that point to survive. And so they'll maybe get into clandestine sorts of black market behaviors like drug trade. I mean, it's unbelievable. The pipeline that we've created, that we punish people on multiple points of their adolescence. And by the time they get to adulthood, they've already been criminalized. And so hunger seems to me so central to this set of issues.
It is. Yeah. And I think, a couple of things that I've heard people who are living in poverty say is, we're cut out of the big economy that's existing, the legal economy in this country. We're not able to get jobs. They're not in our neighborhoods. And so people create their own economies. There is a direct connection between when we leave people behind, they're going to do whatever it takes to survive. A couple weeks ago, I was in DC with an event that was lifting up community voices of people who had experienced hunger and poverty. And I was listening to this woman on a panel who had received SNAP benefits, and she talked about the life-saving impact that it had on her and her family. And one of the things she said was, I was worried that my son, who was in high school at the time might start participating in a side economy because he knew that we needed money to put food on the table. And because of SNAP, because we received assistance and we received this help, we were able to put food on the table, and we were able to keep him out of trouble.
Wow.
And it was a powerful story for her to tell. And it was a really honest thing to say, that desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of popular conceptions around poverty, there's a sense that people are either lazy or they're bad. They just make bad choices because they want to be bad.
Yeah.
Or they're not rational. But I mean, having met people who actually live in poverty, who are incredibly more resourceful and intelligent with their spending patterns because they have to be,
right, or
they won't survive. It's incredibly mind altering to try to resist all of the conceptions that we've been handed.
Right. Yeah. Like I said before, I've never talked to a person that wanted to be in poverty, that wanted to live that way, that wanted to wander, month to month, whether they were going to have enough food to put on the table. There was an interesting study out of Princeton a couple years ago, maybe a year ago, that looked at the impact that scarcity had on people. So it was a really interesting study. They interviewed people just, in a public setting like a mall, and they gave them, they categorized them as, low or middle or higher income. And they gave them situations where they had to make an economic decision. So when you start, you give them a low cost thing. So your car breaks down, you take it to the mechanic. You need your car to get to work and to, the doctor and to your kids to school and all this stuff. And the mechanic says it's going to cost you $100 to fix. So people would answer that question about what they would do, and then they would take an IQ test. And then they would give them a different scenario. It's going to cost you $3,000 to fix. And what they found, that under that stress, IQ levels dropped when income levels were different. So for the lower income people, the amount of stress that you are put under caused you to not be able to function in other settings, because that's what you were thinking about. Your IQ, your ability to take an intelligence test was different. And they actually found that the effect of that level of stress was the same as staying up all night.
So the people who are higher income that they interviewed didn't have much of a change in their IQ testing before and after the scenario, but the people who are low income had a huge change, a huge drop.
Right.
And I understand, I have limited medical understanding of this, but stress hormones, cortisol being one of the main ones, right, is not only linked to the higher levels of cortisol, inability to absorb and learn new tasks and make decisions, but also linked to obesity and diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. Right. So I think it's crucial to emphasize your work as being situated squarely in the center of medicine.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's, also to go off of the ability to navigate a system. I mean, I have a master's degree and I have a hard time understanding the rules to all the programs. And so, people living in poverty and people participating in assistance programs have to put a lot of energy into figuring out, where do I go to apply for this? Where do I go to apply for that? Is my income too high for this program, but enough for this program? And all of that, in addition to just the hardship that you're facing in balancing a budget, is stressful. And I hear women talk about all the time the stress that it ensues when you're sitting in the welfare office or you're waiting to find out whether you're going to get your housing subsidy. And it does have a direct implication on health. And this is why the pediatricians that I work with started this policy work, because they realized, we can try to manage people's health all we want. We could try to help these children. I work with pediatricians who work in a clinic for children with failure to thrive, which is a condition where they're not meeting height and weight benchmarks for their age. And they realized, I can tell parents all day long until I'm blue in the face how to feed their kid. And if they don't have the resources to make it happen, then they're going to continue to bring their child in with this exact same health issue. And so many hospitals are now starting to use innovative designs for addressing food insecurity among their populations to really think about how access to food is impacting patient care. And many pediatricians, the American Association of Pediatrics has made food insecurity and hunger one of its top issues. They just released a policy statement last week saying that they think pediatricians should screen for food insecurity as part of routine care for families, because it's a recognition that we can prescribe or we can treat patients in our clinics, but unless parents have the resources to provide for them at home, they're going to continue to present with the same conditions.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. You can see the cyclical nature of it.
Right.
So you studied theology
for
your master's degree, and now you're doing something in public policy and research.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about before doing the interview that you were looking forward to talking about the theological and ethical implications of this work for you. What does this mean for you personally?
Yeah. So I studied theology because I was interested in social justice and systems change issues. I was interested in the prophets and in the prophetic nature of Jesus Christ and in his ability to challenge the system. I think, I grew up in a conservative church and Christian context that made Jesus out to be this really nice figure that said some lovely things and then was crucified and rose again. And then when I started studying theology and studying the Bible in college in particular, I started to realize, wow, Jesus was really out to change some systems and was really out to challenge the structures of the day. And I felt called to that I didn't want to just serve the poor at soup kitchens, that I wanted to realize that really, I think we are called as Christians to take down those systems of injustice and to challenge those ideas that people deserve that, or that we should just look the other way. And so I always tell people, I graduated from the School of Theology. I got a master's in divinity, but I just took a sidestep over to public health, and I'm just doing some ministry in this field of public health. And I can't think of anything more clear in the Bible than what Jesus has to say about the poor and about children and about feeding the hungry.
Yeah, his ministry was to heal society.
Right.
And yeah, we have this situated in a first century context of it, in a sense of miracles, but there is such a strong narrative of feeding everybody.
Right.
Both in Jesus' ministry, feeding everyone, making sure everyone gets fed, everyone, feeding the multitudes with few resources. And then in the early church, the idea of communion is being a meal that everyone could share together, that would be equal and that would not respect class.
Right.
That, Paul said, some of you are bringing this really rich food, and then some people show up to eat at the community meal and have nothing.
Right.
Let's just even the playing field. Everybody share everything so that no one has to be ashamed in their state of income. And so I don't know where in the world we lost track of that, and where in the world we thought that should be siphoned off and owned as a Christian thing, instead of going back into society and transforming society in the way that we function as a society.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there's sometimes this idea that you got what you deserve. And I don't think that Jesus preaches that. I don't think Jesus says, oh, you got leprosy because you deserved it, or you're poor because you deserved it. I think that he does have this radical way of existing in the world that shows love and care to not just everyone, to the most vulnerable of society. Jesus didn't say blessed is everyone. Jesus said blessed are the poor, because he realized that he was living in a context that didn't believe blessed are the poor. That's why you have to exert power and say things, because it's not real. unless he spoke it and unless he reminded people, this is what we need to focus on. And I felt so compelled by some of that call, to really, at first I thought I wanted to do direct service things, and I'm not knocking people that do direct service. They provide a valuable ministry and service to this country. We cannot live without them, without the people that are running the food banks and the soup kitchens. But we need to work towards a bigger picture, towards dismantling the systems that make it necessary for us to build food banks and soup kitchens.
Yeah, that's so well said. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this. I've learned so much today just talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Is there any final thing that you want to say for a takeaway that you want people to hang on to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I'm continually saying is this isn't just a problem for the 14% of U.S. households living in food insecurity, or for the 19.5% of families with children living with food insecurity. This is a problem for all of us, and that we need to realize that this is a public issue, that this is something that we need to shine light on, and as a society and as a country, we need to address and to fix, and the future of our country relies on it.
So well said. Thank you so much. I was really almost moved to tears at several points of this conversation. So listeners, I hope you enjoyed that. This is, again, Allison Bovell, who works at Children's Health Watch, and an honor to have you here today. This has really been mind-altering for me in the last couple of years, just coming to understand how all of this plays together. And so we thank you for your participation, and thank you again, Allison, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.